Bienvenidos, señoras y señores. África y América Latina comparten mucho en común históricamente, pero existe un vacío inmenso y un desconocimiento mutuo entre estos dos espacios debido a la insuficiencia, o mejor dicho, a la falta de proyectos de intercambio entre ellos. Con la edición 2021 del programa llamado La Literatura Hoy, que organiza la Biblioteca Luis Ángel Arango con autoras y autores africanos, conversamos con los mejores autores africanos sobre su arte, sus contextos históricos, sus perspectivas sobre los conceptos literarios vigentes en la esfera literaria africana. Hoy tenemos como invitada una poeta que se llama Susan Kiguli. Susan Kiguli es una poeta, una profesora de literatura ugandesa que se ha destacado de un lado por su producción poética y de otro lado por su trabajo en la crítica literaria africana. Publicó en el año 1998 una colección de poemas con el título de African Saga, la saga africana. Este poemario debido una referencia en muchos contextos y muchas universidades africanas, americanas y europeas por su potencia metafórica y su manera de poner en cuestión a través del arte los sistemas de opresión en un contexto postcolonial. En 2012 siguió su segunda colección, Home Floats in the Distance, publicado con la traducción en alemán bajo el título de Tu Hause treibt in der Ferne. En español sería como La casa flota en la distancia. Susan Kiguli es muy comprometida en los espacios de la promoción de derechos de mujeres y siendo la fundadora de FemRight, una estructura que promueve la publicación de las obras literarias por autoras femeninas. Y pertenece también al jurado del Commonwealth Writers Prize. Ahora vamos a tener una discusión con esta autora en inglés. You are highly welcome, Susan, to this discussion, and it's my pleasure to be leading this discussion with you and to, share with the public about your work, about your ideology concerning writing, and of course about the context that has led to this wonderful poetic production which you have to your name. I would begin with a very simple assertion which I think is in sync with your poetry. And I think from my reading of your poems in the two collections, which are the most popular outputs by your humble self, that your poems or your poetry are underlined by a sense of resilience. And this can be seen from the fact that your very first poem in your very first collection is titled, has resilience in its title. And so I wanted to know why resilience? Does it mean that the context in which you write is so demanding, it's so exacting that you need your poetry to portray a kind of will to life or will to live, kind of vitality? So why is resilience such an important aspect, such a life wire, across all your poems?
Thank you, Gilbert. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you. And I hope that it all goes very well. To answer that question, I think that I want to say that because I am here in Africa, I cannot run away from the notion of resilience. And I want, as a writer, to write about African existence and many times about African women and African womanhood and African survival And because of that, I have to write within my context. And I have to write within trying to understand the times and to understand my existence, our existence, not only as human beings, because we are human beings, but also as people who come from a specific continent. Thus, for me, identity is a very important part of how I see things. And to live here, I think one has to make up the mind to survive. There are so many forces in the world, but those sometimes seem to be amplified in our existence here on the continent. That sometimes you do not know whether what you say on the continent will cost one's life. You don't know whether what you will say may cost someone else's life. You do not know whether what you will say will be able to uphold somebody. And so there is a friend of mine who is really now almost a blood sister, if one could manufacture that. And we joke and we say that people who don't know us and who dismiss us do not know that we come from a long line of proud and strong women. If they knew that, then they would not sometimes do the things they do against us or to us. I think to be an African woman especially, but also to be African, is to be resilient, is to make up your mind to survive against all odds, to make up your mind to be happy within your context, because there's so much happiness. We've just concluded a conference on radical joy in Eldoret in Kenya. And there's so, because people talk so much about African sadness that we forget that we have more happiness than sadness. But even within that happiness, you have to make up your mind that you will see that happiness and not hear other voices who may declare that you're not happy. And therefore, I think the whole notion of survival is very central to my own ideological sense.
Exactly.
I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You've answered the question, I mean, quite squarely, and I find a synergy in terms of ideas between, in that sense, poetry by Black women on the continent and also poetry by Black women in diaspora, because the discourse that you've just expatiated upon is also very current in Afro-descendants communities in Colombia, where I've actually been privileged to spend some years. So I mean, like, you have also that current of resilience, of the will to survive against all odds, very present, in the poetry of Colombian Afro-Colombian authors like Marie Grueso, like Ashanti Orozco. So it's quite interesting, I mean, to see this connectivity, these connections, across the board. Yeah, so I mean, and then I want to narrow it down to I mean, you've actually made reference to, the symbols on which you actually anchor, this idea of resilience, and in that first in that poem that opens your collection, African Saga, the poem is titled "The Resilient Tree." You narrow it down to the image of the woman, and I quote a stanza from that poem: that a woman, a Black woman, is a bottle brush whose attraction lies in her tears, whose grace is in her bending, whose red flowers are a source of strength to all. That is quite striking, and I think very captured in a very picturesque manner. And I want to say, now there is in your poetry, of course, this this image of the woman, but of course, your poetry is also quite personal. Quite personal in a way that it seems to draw also from your own immediate life circumstance. So, what role might your mother have played in your life? Because you make reference quite much to the image of the mother, of course, at the personal level, but also at the more existentialist level, at the more general level. Image of the mother.
You see, the mother, even before you start talking about mother at my personal level, the mother is a very strong and central force in our existence. And that is not because sometimes when we talk about mother, and then people think we are generalizing, and we are talking about mothers without actually acknowledging their function in society, and that talking about mothers within just talking about them, we might actually lead to smothering their voices. But I think that in my own understanding, mothers are not just central to our existence because they're housekeepers, because they breastfeed us, but they are central because they're the intellectual machine even by which the patriarchal system runs. Because the patriarchal system allows mothers to be custodians of stories. If you are a custodian of a story, if you are a custodian of words, you are the most powerful as far as human standing is concerned. Because without a voice, in my understanding, there is no human being. Without being able to name, as Audre Lorde said, without being able to name, without being able to say who you are, then you're nothing. And therefore, mothers in an African context stand out as the pillars on which our very existence depends. Mothers not only carry us forward and not only teach us how to stand in a precarious world, but they also prop us up every time that we may even maybe feel like falling. My own mother was widowed at the age of 27. I don't like to talk about family history because I have not asked for permission to talk about it. But my mother was a widow, became a widow, although I put that in a poem, a poem that is not yet published, but has been performed, Mother in National Colors. She was widowed at the age of 27. And she had 6 of us, with one of us about to be born. And she was able to bring us up without going to drown in a lake or a river or something. And she used the structures that were available to her. She used the people, because you have to understand how Africa works. Africa works in a very interesting way. African society works in a very interesting way. It is patriarchal, and I think that I live in a patriarchal system. The Ugandan system, if I can generalize, is a patriarchal system, but it's also a communal system. And it makes communality a very tangible thing. A child is not does not belong to one person. And this is not by lip service. This is the actual reality, even in circumstances like now, when we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are all locked in our homes and we can't visit. In fact, one of the things that our societies are suffering with is trying to make sense of being alone, because we don't know that, we don't speak that language. We speak the language of we, and we do not pay lip service to the language of we. The language of we in our circumstances is very real. And therefore, my mother did not bring us up by her own hand alone. She joined her hand to the hands of others and brought us up. But it had to be her to make that decision, to say, I'm going to bring up my children. I'm going to make sure they go to school. Because in our circumstances here in Uganda, it is still very important to go to school. Education is still very important. If you want to get anywhere, if you want to speak, even though, of course, there is the irony that when you go to school, you start to speak a language that is a colonial language, like English. And therefore, here I am speaking English, and maybe not so very many of my people will understand English in the same, at the same level as they would understand perhaps my language, Luganda. And I live in a multilingual society. And therefore, there are so many languages. In this small country, Uganda, we have over 52 languages. And therefore, we have a complexity of things.
Exactly.
How do you survive with this?
Exactly.
Yeah, I can
Now,
see
the issue that you mentioned, like when you possess the voice, I mean, it is key to your existence. And I want to see your poetry also as the assertion, the affirmation of that voice, that peculiar voice, sharing your vision with the world. But then an aspect of your poetry that I also find quite intriguing is the reflexivity. You are reflexive about your own poetry. Just before we began, I told you that you were going to read at the end a poem, the kind of poetry that I write. I mean, this is you thinking about your own practice as a poet. I think you have a number of poems that actually make us. I mean, like that. Try to to rethink your poetry, and I want to also connect it to the fact that you some sort of find yourself faced with circumstances in which maybe words at face value might not be enough or might not really capture what you want to transmit. And if you look at poems, you have a number of poems that actually put to question the capacity of words to to like capture reality. I am tired of talking in metaphors, for example. Yes. So I'm tired of talking in metaphors. You have also examples of poems like viewers may find these pictures disturbing, where the word become an image that can be viewed, can be seen, you know, and so many so many poems. Like for example, you have tempting a troubled past. The poem refuses to be written. I mean, these are quite wonderful poems that actually offer a critique of poetry, a kind of self-critique, of the author. I mean, why do I write? And is my poetry sufficient, to carry, the what is within me? And it reminds me of the very well-known debate by Theodor Adorno, who said in the face of the Holocaust and like poetry was important. It was difficult to write poetry after Auschwitz. That's what he said. But of course, that idea was argued back to him by Paul Celan, who said, yeah, works of art are challenged by such difficult moments in our history. But that is when they even assert themselves the more. That's when even poetry becomes, or writing in general, becomes pertinent and even necessary. So I want to know whether, I mean, as a poet, you have felt at some point that your poetry was not enough, or was not the most appropriate way of intervening, in certain, I mean, which means that, I mean, at some point you have been called to reconsider what you might think of as your form of intervening or your form of commitment. We know the whole notion of commitment, and the way you write one stanza in one of your poems stands out to me. I'm reading from, I am tired of talking in metaphors. All I want is to stop denying me. My presence needs no metaphors. I am here just as you are, for you to dismantle whenever you will. I demand for my human dignity. So, I mean, I find you standing in your poem, as Adrienne Rich would say in her, in one of her poems, I mean, in the collection Atlas of a Difficult World. I am an immigrant teller who says a coat is not a piece of cloth only. I have dreamed of Zion. I have dreams of world revolution. I am a corpse dredged from a canal in Berlin, a river in Mississippi. I am a woman standing. I am standing here in your poem, unsatisfied. Please, can you respond to that? I found that synergy quite interesting for me, because it echoes very well in your poem.
I was just continuing to listen to Adrienne Rich's work, because her work explodes spaces and escapes boundaries, and it's so beautiful. So I was just now carried away. I think that's a very difficult question, but I think that words are important, but sometimes, being human, we feel that the human tongue is not enough to express the weight of experience. And yet, we can only actually express the weight of experience by words. And I think that for one to be able to reflect on the importance of words, to reflect on poetry as a practice, it's a way of showing that poetry is activism. Sometimes I am unable to separate poetry from activism, to separate writing from activism. Activism as an action that repeats itself to assert human existence, to assert people's rights, to assert people's voices, to assert people's identity, to carve out spaces for people. Poetry as a practice that dares to look and try to name, even when one feels unable to name something. How do you name a mutilated child? How do you put voice to a starving child? How do you explain rape? How do you explain starvation? Experience seems sometimes to rob one of one's ability to articulate. And yet we must articulate. This is the irony. We must articulate these things, because if we do not articulate these things, then we will erase ourselves. That's why I want to think about what it is that I want to express. So language to me is an extremely important. And language is important not because it's my language, but because we have all these languages that can speak together. In a poem I read in, I don't know if I have it here, in a poem I read in Bonn in 2019, it's one of those poems that I love. It is translated, I wrote it in Luganda. My colleague, Merit Kavugo, translated it into English. My colleague, William Wakaba, translated it into German. The poem, I'll just read just the first stanza. Laba abaganda balugela, abataka abagala nave balima akambu. N'olwekyo olulimi oluro bwe lukwatagana n'olwange mu ngalo, laba bwe zikumba ne zijaagaana ne zifuweeta enfumo n'ebyafaayo ebyange n'ebibyo. Laba bwe zinyumya ne zifuga olukalu lw'ensi. Laba bwe zireetera obutakkaanya okufuluka. Laba obutakolagana kigwo kifulukwa. And then the translation is, behold, the Baganda have a proverb. Only good neighbors can eradicate couch grass from their fields. So when your language holds hands with my language, behold how they march along jubilantly, and they orate tales and chronicles, my chronicles and your chronicles. Behold how they dialogue and rule over the earth. Behold how they subdue conflict. Behold how disagreement becomes a dilapidated house. It becomes a scornful miscarriage. We despise it because your language is holding hands with my language.
Okay, thanks so much. And then so from what you've said, it also brings me to the point that you seem to be writing from a context where injustice has become so rampant. Most of your poems are really poems that are trying to make the voice of the voiceless heard. You paint situations where children's rights are being trampled upon and they can't, fight back, and so where women's rights and all, prisoners of conscience. So you seem to really paint a tableau of a situation where human rights generally are not respected. What is the historical explanation for this? I understand that you also wrote at a time when I think your poetry is a bit historical because you gesture towards the period of Idi Amin. For the sake of our viewers, Idi Amin was a ruthless Ugandan dictator who also committed several human rights infringements, and so your poetry also gives us like an idea of the era of Idi Amin, and of course it's not the main target because also successive regimes in Uganda haven't totally respected democratic norms. So the background of your poetry seemed to be, to really be woven, in that context of injustice, non-respect of human rights. Can you throw more light on that?
Yeah, I think any writer anywhere has to write about injustice because this world is unjust. This not only in Uganda, but everywhere. Of course, sometimes in Africa, it's amplified. And you get things like vaccine apartheid. But injustice in a world where I come from, in Uganda, for example, as far as I know, the colonialists came here and decided that they wanted to protect us because my country, Uganda, was a British protectorate. So the British came here and decided that they needed to protect us against ourselves. My question is, who asked them that we needed to be protected against ourselves? Did we ever express that? I wasn't there, so I cannot answer that question. But there is the possibility that our colonial administrators, in their own wisdom, presumed that we were not satisfied with our existence. And so they needed to come. You see, these are the things of superiority of race. So someone comes in, has not had a conversation with, but comes in to tell you that you, as you are, you're not good enough. And so then things begin to run on their heads, if it were. They begin to walk on their heads. I'm not saying that pre-colonial society was not unjust, because this world has been, from my own reading and from my own understanding, it has run on conflict. One village attacking another village. Tribal wars, or like I like to call them, ethnic conflicts. But of course, then when outside intrusion comes in, it explodes everything, because you're now not dealing with just peers. You're dealing with someone who thinks he or she is not your peer, but your benefactor, your benevolent protector. And then things are no longer at the same level. And therefore, African situations are very complex. I'm not saying situations outside Africa or situations outside the so-called third world are not complex. But our situations in the so-called third world have been made even more complex by the very issue of colonialism, by the very issue of someone trying to control, by the very issue of racism, by the very issue, and racism is not gone. Otherwise, we hear of George Floyd, but that is just because that was captured on camera. You don't know what happens on day-to-day basis. And it is not only, this whole racism is not even racism of black and white, but it's also, it can be racism of white against white, black against black. It's very complex. It's very confusing. And therefore, I, as a writer, feel that I have a responsibility to myself and to the people that I live with, to talk about these things, to point out these things, to make us think, not to point out to preach, no, to point out so that we can think about this, so that we can interrogate these issues, so that we can question ourselves, so that we can stop being complacent. So so that we can ask questions like, where did Amin come from? What was the history of Amin? And if that was the history, is it as simple as that? Who was supporting Amin? Why did Amin stay for over almost 8 years or 9 years? Where were Ugandans when Amin was ruling over us? Where were Zimbabweans when Mugabe was ruling over them? Where were, the Nigerians when Abacha was? Why did Soyinka have to run out of his country? I think for me, writing, not only poetry, writing is a practice of constant interrogation of issues, constant questioning of issues, constant reflection on issues, constant bearing of language, of trying to see how language works in different ways and in different contexts. That writing is not a constant practice. It's a practice that shifts with context, with relationships, with emotions, with different periods. So for me, to think about writing is to think about questioning the very idea of humanity and the very idea of humanness.
Exactly. So one could say that, I mean, that your writing is a form of solidarity also with those who are fighting just injustice anywhere on earth. Now, I noticed, of course, you can refute that in the African Saga, of course, maybe it has to do with your evolution as a writer, that the themes are, to an extent, although you have poems on existentialism, on environment, and and on love, even romantic love, that when it has to do with the political situation, I mean, the poems are somewhat much more direct when it comes to Uganda. Whereas in your second collection, I mean, there's kind of opening up. Might it also have to do with your, the fact that maybe you wrote the second collection, maybe as you, because you're also a scholar, maybe living in other different countries, and maybe more exposed, and taking the world as your oyster, and being able to relate, quite, with every situation in the world. I'm just assuming you can refute that if you want.
Right. I think you are in a way right and you are in a way wrong. I think you're right because when one travels, one sees other contexts, one sees other situations, one relates to other people, and one begins to attempt to understand how people live from different places. My people have a proverb, atana tambla yatenda nyino kufumba, that the one who hasn't traveled is the one who praises his or her mother's cooking. So when you travel, the world opens up. In my second collection, there's a poem that I really like. I don't privilege one poem over others. But I still find myself, maybe I don't really like it, but I go back to it quite a lot. And this poem was written when I was in South Africa. It's called The Rainbow Nation. And I'll read two of its stanzas. The Rainbow Nation. Standing at the harbor in Durban, I too see the rainbow over this nation. I see in the ultramarine blue of the ocean a stream of lights from the skies diving into water, making colors live together in harmony. I see a rainbow of power in the faces of the women. Albertina Sisulu, rock that produces water. I see fountains for the nations in the fields planted by our mothers. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, on the back red with pain, I read history and courage. Presence Magogo of Dinizul, voice clear, singing of Robert Sobukwe and Chief Ruthuli. In the voices of our women, I hold a people. And maybe the last stanza of this poem is, in the freedom born to young women, a rainbow is flaming, a rainbow over this nation, set against the brightness of blood and the twinkling of tears, fashioned in the dreams of eagles that will take heights and stand above the hurricanes of harrowing pasts and weather-beaten futures. On the shoulders of the women, I hold the people.
Wow.
So to answer your question, I began to be passionate about the people, as I'm passionate about my country, as I'm passionate about Uganda. Although that doesn't mean that other places take precedence or even can stand on the equal platform with Uganda, because I was born and nurtured by this nation. This is where I feel, even if I'm deceived, this is where I feel I belong. This is where I feel I'm understood in a way that no other place can understand. No other place has my umbilical cord buried in its soil.
Yeah, I want to come in there because there's that identification with your homeland. Of course, the concept of home, we are going to come to that. I mean, it's quite prominent in your work, and of course, it features in the title of the second collection. So the concept of home, but there's a kind of troubled relationship with home. And again, I'm coming back to the idea of Uganda. From my readings of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his memoirs, and then from your poetry, Uganda had a kind of, a privileged status. I mean, in terms of, okay, as privileged as any space in colonial context could be. But the fact that you actually have a poem titled "The Pearl of Africa," so Uganda was considered as the pearl of Africa. So, and also it's a nation that is quite rich, in natural resources and strategically well placed. But then there's a feeling that one has that the country hasn't lived up to its full potential. And when I read your poetry, and you are disturbed patriotism, with your home country. I think of this dramatic piece by Alex Mukulu, 60 Years of Banana. I mean, it's much
30
like,
years
yeah,
of banana.
This is a land of riches, but then, ironically, there is scarcity. I mean, how do you reconcile with that image of because your poetry, like most of African writers' works, it seems to be a kind of a time machine, questioning what has happened to independence. 60 years after independence, what kind of balance sheet do we frankly give ourselves if we look at the reality in straight in its eyes?
This is a very complex question, because I don't even know whether I understand this whole notion of independence, whether I even believe that we are independent, and whether even we should have thought about this whole issue of independence. But well, here we are independent. And Uganda was hailed at independence as a country that was developing at a very fast rate, as a country that was going to be extremely prosperous. And then Obote decided that the kingdoms should be shut down. They should be locked. The history of centuries should be locked and abolished. And then Amin decided that people should just be killed every day, Sapati and Oji. And so, and then Amin, instead of trying to understand our history and understand and deal with the difficult questions of ethnic tensions and maybe domination by different ethnicities, taking Indians as part of our ethnic composition because they were brought to us by colonialism. I mean, decide to get a whole ethnic group and send it out of where they were born, of where they were, settling as home. And so we are constantly, we are constantly fighting this land that has so much, but gives some people nothing, and gives a few people a lot of things. This land where a dictator like Amin can start to slaughter people, and no one is able to fight him. This land has a lot of contradictions, and therefore I cannot have a linear or a straightforward relationship with this land. I cannot have a straightforward relationship with my community when I see that when there is a pandemic like this one, the girls suffer more. Yes, all of us are, all the children are out of school. But who is getting married at 13? Is it the boys? You see, these questions trouble me, and therefore I cannot stand and say I'm a settled soul, because these things are ever constantly in my face, and I'm seeking answers to questions that do not seem to find answers easily. And so that's why you see that I love this nation so much, but I'm also puzzled by what we produce out of it ourselves, because it is our nation. But then it's even more complex, because we cannot take all the blame. Even when people say, oh, Africans, you should stop blaming colonialism because colonialism was 60 years ago. Yes, but that history is still influencing us. So how can we deny that history? We cannot. I don't know if I'm answering.
You have actually answered the question, and then I want to bring you back to something I mentioned in terms of writing as a form of, expressing your solidarity with people, who fight for justice everywhere in the world. And one thing that, in terms, at the level of the structure of your poems, that one notices is the fact that you dedicate your poems explicitly to, I would say, comrades, writers who are comrades, I would say. And I can name some of them: Peter Nazareth, Jack Mapanje. Of course, you also feature, Christopher Okigbo in your poem, those to whom you dedicate your poetry, and quite a lot of others. I was wondering, why do you do that? Because, for example, is it just about dedicating, or maybe these authors whom you mention form some sort of literary circle to which you belong? In the case, I'm bringing an example. In the case of Colombia, of course, the famous Garcia Marquez had this kind of circle of friends, including Germán. You have Germán Vargas. You also have Alonso Fuenmayor and other Fuentes Cepada, with whom he used to share his manuscripts for feedback. So most of his writings were some sort of done with in a kind of circle. And in Africa, I also have the example of the Congo Brazzaville, having to do with an author that I know much about, Sonny Labutangsi, who also belonged to this group of friends, Emmanuel Dongala, Henri Lopez, with whom he used to share his manuscript. So they form a kind of fraternity of writers. I wanted to know whether, in your case too, there was that kind of fraternity. Of course, it can be metaphorical too, not just because Christopher Okigbo, I think, died long before you ever started writing. Yeah, but just to respond to that, I found it quite intriguing.
He actually died before I was born. Yeah. Yeah, you see, I think as writers and as artists, we form solidarity at different levels. Probably Harold Bloom will call it the anxiety of influence. There are people that the moment you begin to read African poetry, you have to come face to face with Christopher Okigbo. You have to contend with his work, and question things. Who is this mother Idoto? Naked I stand before you. What is happening in Christopher Okigbo's life, but also Christopher Okigbo in terms of African literature, at least from the time that we studied African literature, Christopher Okigbo was a very prominent voice in terms of all the, he's even dying on a battlefield for an artist. And I remember in classes we used to have debates about this. Why did this man, Almas Rui actually wrote a play questioning his going to fight as an artist. So what is the role of an artist? But going back, I mean, I don't know if I can actually think about poetry without thinking about African oral poetry, without thinking about orature, but without also thinking about certain names, such as Christopher Okigbo, such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, because the very concept of my writing in Luganda is influenced by him.
Permit me narrow it down to Jack Mapanje, because I mean he is the most prominent in among this in this list.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. As you know, Jack Mapanje, who I started to write to write about and to read his poetry before I even met him, was a very central figure in our understanding of poetry at university. That we even acted a play about him in prison, but and they captured it on video, but before we could release it, Jack Mapanje was out of prison.
Oh.
And later I met Jack Mapanje, because and Jack Mapanje is a very interesting personality, because Jack Mapanje as a poet, even as a person, he's humorous, but Jack Mapanje as a poet is very cynical. Jack Mapanje as a poet is very angry. Jack Mapanje as a poet is very bold. Jack Mapanje as a person is very gentle. He's very soft-spoken. Even when he reads his poem, his poem skipping without rocks. He doesn't read it the way I read it. He reads it gently, but this is his most defiant poem. You see, so I am influenced at both at personal level, because these are personal friends. I was about to say personal friends, but then I remembered my English teacher used to say, if it's a friend, then that friend is personal. So this whole concept of personal friends is very strange. So, but I know Jack Mapanje personally. I have not met Ni Oshundere, but we have spoken on phone. And Ni Oshundere is also a very big presence in my thinking about poetry. David Rubadiri taught me. David Rubadiri was a father to me. You see, so
Peter Nazareth.
I've never met in person Peter Nazareth, but Peter Nazareth is a very present figure. I mean, I have spoken to him in writing. We have written to each other, and you know how Peter Nazareth is. He's a person who goes out to nurture and to build. That has been his life's mission. And I think that is the man. That is how he lived his life as a young artist, and that is how he has lived his life all along. So I never get surprised that he was in Iowa, getting all these writers and nurturing them and building a community of writers. That is his way. And therefore, I cannot think about the Indian question in Uganda without thinking about Peter Nazareth. Because for me, he is immediate. He's not just a name I hear. He's a person I know. I may not have been able to sit and drink tea with Peter Nazareth, but in a metaphorical level, I have done so. And I have all these friends that we meet at literary festivals and sit and argue about things. So that's why when you said Lebo had been part of this program, I said, oh,
yes, she's been here, and I think at the end of the day we are going to share the links, and you will meet each other through this wonderful program by La Biblioteca Luis Angel Arango. Now we are moving towards the end of our discussion, and now I want us to end on a striking note, and I think it's not just because we want to be idealistic, but because the idea of hope is quite important also in your poetry. In as much as you paint the difficult terrain which you have to tread on as a writer, as a citizen, there's also a very strong basis of hope in your poetry. And you have it across many of your poems. I mean, like, because I love this land, and I will sing about a risen song, like, so I want to know, like, what really, because even in the most cynical and bleak poem, you always end on a note of hope. In some of the poems, that note of hope has some sort of religious basis, which one, I mean, it's more like John Donne, metaphysical poetry, in terms of. But then I want to see, I want to hear from you, what is the basis of that hope that things can get better? And not only, in the context of Uganda, but also generally, because you write for a global audience,
I don't know if I write for a global audience, but I think we won't discuss that this interview. But I'm also interested, if I answer your question, that you mentioned John Donne, because he's one of those, the metaphysical poets, especially John Donne. I really do find him very fascinating because of his use of wit, of getting a very simple subject and making you think about it. I'm a triple fool for loving, and putting it in whining poetry so that people then get it and play it to music. And then my sorrow becomes, spread all over. And he's a very interesting, the romantic poets and the metaphysical poets, even when we're all surrounded by this decolonize everything, I still cling on to these because they speak to me as a person. And I know that they come with these histories, but who does not have a history? Exactly. This is where it gets very controversial. Who does not have a history? And so sometimes, to me, these poets are individual poets. And they're not just what people say, dead white males. No. They're speaking from a position of pain. You look at John Keats, and it's a different world. It's a very interesting world he builds up. But back to the issue of hope.
Yes, exactly.
It's Mapanje who said in one of his poems, hope is our only hope. We cannot live without looking forward. we cannot deny the future. And we cannot doom the future by claiming that the future is doomed. Because if you remember J.L. Austin, how to do things with words, if our speech acts like I believe, because I have a linguistic background, do actually cause action, then it is up to us to speak the actions we want to see in reality, to be able to cause them to come to life. And therefore, hope is a very important feature of our survival. And survival is very important to me, that even when I'm gone, there will be other people. And they may not even think like me, but they'll be there. So I have the hope that these situations that I don't like will change. I have the hope that the poets that will come after me will be better than us. I have the hope that those people who at the moment try to sit on other people's heads will stop, that we will make them stop, that will compel them to stop. I have the hope, and you said it has a religious dimension. Yes, I am that person who has a religion. I believe I'm a Christian, but I also believe that if there are things in Christianity that are not right, I am not going to stand and defend them. See? But that does not deny my belief in Christianity. And one reason why I'm a Christian is because Christianity preaches hope for me. And it says there is a world after this one. Exactly. But there is also this world. It doesn't deny this world. And in my worldview, we cannot live in the next world. We first have to live here and make here better. You cannot say there is heaven there and it will be good when you are making hell out of your own space and making other people fail to live. That is injustice. That is unacceptable. That is simply not done. And I cannot stand and condone it.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yeah, I mean, like, I think one thing that is clear to me is that you know, poetry runs in your veins, and the very diversity of your poems, I mean, you know, makes me believe that you speak to your own self in poetry, because you express your ideology through poetry, you express political views through poetry, you expect environmental views, and you even tell yourself your love stories through poetry. Quite interesting. If we had time, would have dwelt on that aspect of love also, which is quite key in all dimensions. But then I want us to close at this juncture. We've had a very rich discussion, and I think it's befitting for us to close with that last poem in your second poetry collection, the last poem. What kind of poems do you write?
All right, here we go. What kind of poems do you write? I write poems which hang their heads down, flicking nails and stammering. Poems with hands in pockets, whistling, oblivious of debris down the lane. Political poems, brazen finger jabbing. We are in the middle of a war to stop a war. Poems hungry and desperate, huddled together with empty bowls on their laps. Poems angry and ferocious, bellowing and grunting with bare teeth and glaring eyes. Poems enticing like chocolate flakes on ice cream. Even then, the children are screaming at flying chaperones and bleeding faces.
Thank you very much, Susan. On that wonderful note, we end this discussion, and thanks for your wonderful responses to my questions. And yeah, we hope we'll have much or many other programs to do with the with the Colombian public. And thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Señoras y señores, ahora terminamos esta discusión muy rica y con esta frase muy, muy interesante y en lo que dice nuestra invitada hoy, la esperanza es la única esperanza que tenemos. Por eso, por favor, hay que quedarse atentos a nuestros últimos diálogos con autores y autoras africanos. Muchísimas gracias.